To kick off our study in evolution, we're going to talk about the principles of natural selection. Evolution is termed the mechanism for how biological species change over time. So it is the process of biological change in a population over time that makes the descendants genetically different from their ancestors. And there's really two different types of evolution. There's microevolution, which can occur on a very small scale, affecting usually a single population or a single species. And then there's macroevolution. That's like a large scale that usually affects changes in a lot of different species across many populations. So before the theory of evolution, people believed in creationism or catastrophism, gradualism, the struggle for existence, uniformitarianism, inheritance of acquired traits, and intelligent design. The most fascinating one is The Struggle for Existence by Thomas Malthus. I talk about this in the college level classes that he was just getting really confused or was applying natural selection to natural species and humans alike. And he later learned that humans, their reproductive patterns and their selective process is just very complicated as opposed to other species. But he was fascinating, and his postulates are still true today. And Lamarck's acquired traits was the famous giraffe story. How did giraffes get long necks? Well, there was a horse that came by, and he stretched out his neck to get the leaves at the top of a tree. And then another horse or giraffe stretched out its neck. And over time, the offspring were gaining these longer and longer necks until they could reach the nice foliage at the top of the tree. Now, we know that genes are not inherited or passed that way, but it was, a hypothesis as far as how there was a mechanism for evolution. But this just points out that Charles Darwin is not responsible for the theory of evolution in its entirety. For hundreds of years before Charles Darwin, humans were always wondering the mechanism of which life exists and how life changes. So we just see multiple different types of philosophies here. Some had parts that turned out to be true once we discovered DNA, and others were just fascinating and a part of history. It wasn't until about 1850 where Charles Darwin first published his theory of natural selection. And that is what is today used as the mechanism for how evolution occurs. Charles Darwin was an English naturalist. He went on his voyage to the Galapagos Islands. He saw that different species of finches, tortoises, variety of different creatures, how they lived on the island differently, but they had very specific characteristics that were for that island, even though they looked similar to creatures that were on the mainland. And it was during these observation studies that he developed his theory of natural selection, the mechanism for how life evolves. So the theory of natural selection is defined by the organisms with the best traits, or what we would call an adaptation. It's going to live longer, and therefore it's going to be more reproductive than other members of that population. And that's going to cause the changes in the population over time to act as inheritable traits from those longer living, highly reproductive individuals in that population. And so when we talk about how organisms survive and live to reproduce, we talk about fitness. Now, fitness is the measurement of how well organisms will survive in an environment and live long enough to be reproductive. This is all based on population genetics, overpopulation of offspring, how there's variation in offspring, how those offspring adaptations fit in the environment, and then descent with modification, how those traits are passed within a natural population. So we're going to talk about these four things individually here so that we can really dive deep into what natural selection really is. So the first principle of natural selection we're going to discuss is overproduction of offspring. Species produce lots of offspring, but there are limited resources like space and food that can cause competition amongst individuals inside of that population. So species are going to overproduce their offspring for what is available for their offspring to live on. This is the first principle of natural selection. You can see my two goats here. They are in competition over their limited resource, which I'm willing to bet is a female, and they butt heads. The second principle is variation. So species contain within all of their genetic diversity and their genome differences that are physical, and these physical traits are often just variations that occur within any species. They can be random mutations, they can be genetic combinations that have happened during crossing over in meiosis. They could be migration, where species have come in and have added new genetic variation to the population. But the principle is that variation exists already amongst the population. This is a hydrangea plant. It's one of my favorite plants, but you can see in this plant that some of it is white, other parts of it are blue or purple. There's also a pink color. So this particular plant contains within its genetic variation different flower colors, or can produce different flower colors. It's a pH that will determine what flower color the plant actually is. But nevertheless, all species contain within it physical traits that have variety. The third principle is adaptation. Adaptations are features, usually physical features, but they can also be like metabolical features that allow an organism to better survive in its environment. We like to think of these adaptations as beneficial, so they're beneficial traits. And so within a population, just due to their benefit, they're going to become more common in the population over time. Because organisms that technically live longer, you would think would be able to reproduce more. And so the changes in the gene pool, that available reproductive DNA, is going to combine with the alleles of the individuals in a population, making those particular adaptations more prevalent within the population. Here we have an aloe plant, which, like any other plant, it's green, it can photosynthesize, but its leaves are very, very thick. It's got fleshy leaves and they're enlarged to accommodate all of the aqueous tissue that's inside of that leaf, which holds a major layer of aqueous tissue inside of the actual plant. And over the top of it, the leaves are very, very waxy. If you feel them, they feel like thick. And that is a adaptation that this particular plant has acquired to not lose water. Now you can think about it in terms of, in order to seal off something, we would put a waxy coating on top of it, and that would prevent, of course, water from leaving. The fourth principle of natural selection is descent with modification. So a change in the overall frequency or the occurrence of a gene over time is going to occur. Natural selection leads to populations that have new phenotypes and physical traits that are adapted to new situations. And their traits come from their ancestors. They're still contained within their genome. It's just that now there's a beneficial principle that is developed where it is now more common in the population. So those beneficial traits become more common over time. In primates, there's a difference between monkeys and apes. Monkeys are 40 million years old. The evidence of them being around is usually 50 million years ago. That's the first fossil that we see, which looks kind of more like a squirrel type creature. But then apes are 25 million years old, and so the population of monkeys over a long period of time has evolved new characteristics that, due to mechanisms of evolution that are very, very different from the original. I mean, if I were to put an ape and a monkey next to each other, you can definitely see the difference. There's a big difference in size. Monkeys have highly developed calls. I know there are some monkeys that even sound, they can make a lion roar. And then, of course, apes, they're very different. They're capable of moving through, the trees, and they spend most of their time on the ground, and monkeys spend most of their time in the trees. So the diverse population of monkeys and apes that we see is just due to a adaptation over long periods of time. Monkeys were originally here, and part of that population was isolated from itself, whether it be the ground, and then one of them lives at the top of the trees, and then the population that was on the ground over a series of events in a long period of time evolved into something that was different, now known as apes.